Hi, I'm Molly Barnes, and this is my story. I was born in London. My dad was the head of Paramount Pictures there in London. My mother was the daughter of the Joseph Moore, who built the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco to Oakland, and also he built boats, and he always put eyes on the boats. So he was always trying to be very actively involved in the art world, as was I. And I was a little kid when we moved back to California, but I had so much fun, and I loved the whole group. When we moved back to California, my dad was working at Paramount. My mother was a socialite. Her life was built around the junior league and things like that, like her Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority at Berkeley and everything. But she was very, very smart, and she got me interested in the idea of doing something more than just sitting around and talking about bridge. When I was working and living in Los Angeles, I went to Berkeley, and I got interested in learning about the art world. I was taking art world classes. I was fascinated by the actors that were going to school with me. I worked with Ray Parker, and I worked with a lot of people that were doing shows and had audiences in Berkeley, and I took up with that. When I was looking for something to do, I looked in the LA Times, and I found an ad for an art gallery, and I thought this would be fun to do. It'd be try an art gallery. It was the Writer Gallery in Los Angeles, and I went there, and it was right across the street from Norm's Restaurant, which is still there. And I went there, and I asked them if I could have a job, and they didn't know much more than I did. They had their first art gallery. They were really excited, and I went in there, and I just stood around and tried to look pretty and look like I knew what they were talking about. I didn't know much about the art world, but I tried to pretend I did and nod all the time. And then I fell in love with some of the artists they were representing. And then I realized after about a year working there that I had to get with a gallery that was more succinct with my ambitions. And so I went to Frank Pearl's. Frank Pearl's was one of the best art dealers in California. He had grown up in France. His brother was the head of the Art Dealers Association in New York. He represented Picasso. Every year he would go to see Picasso and pick out pieces for his yearly show. He had a big gallery in Beverly Hills right on Wilshire Boulevard, and he was the center of a lot of intellectual art. And also the rich showbiz people liked to buy from him because he never made mistakes. And everything was about Picasso or Degas or some master. And I got to be very good friends with him, and he actually proposed to me one day. I thought, well, the guy's only 30 years older than I am, but maybe it'd be fun. And then I thought, no, don't bother him with your plans for a rich wedding. But I did have a great time with him, and I learned a lot about art. And then the next gallery that I went to was Ace Gallery. Doug Christmas was the opposite of Frank Pearl's. Doug Christmas had a gallery in New York. He knew all about who was in, who should be making points in the art business. Everybody hated him because he moved so quickly, except when you worked for him, then you were like a queen. And I went to work for him, and I learned about all of the young artists who were just beginning to make it. And they were all the pop artists. Every group of artists that came after the one before changed the whole style, you know. He was very interested in the younger artists, and I just grabbed right onto him and moved into his world and started discovering all the artists who were talking about nude art or about sexual art. And he had a big studio here when he moved into LA on Wilshire Boulevard, right near the Fountain, Fairfax Avenue Art Gallery, Art Museum. And I stepped right in there, and I just loved it. And then I went to Rolph Nelson. Rolph Nelson was a great guy, and he was a brother-in-law of Gehry. Frank Gehry unfortunately died last week here, but he was so wonderful. And his buildings are all coming up. He would find old, like he found that whole building on Crescent Heights and Sunset, and he bought the whole, the whole acre, and then had everything, including all of the restaurants, torn down. So he had that room for storage for artists and also for people who loved art. And I felt right in home, and I worked there. And then finally I decided it'd be good to get my own gallery, and that's when I looked in the paper one day, and there was a gallery, and I felt like I could go in there and work, and that's what I did. The first shows that I had in my gallery really copied earlier artists, until I found out that what people were looking for were new finds and new descriptions and new people to collect. So I got right into that circle, and I started, one of the people that I started helping was Norman Lear. And Norman Lear was making films at that time, and a friend of his, Dick Dorso, suggested me. So I was interviewing him, and I found out that he was one of the smartest men in the art and education world. He had a gallery and a store already on Highland and Hollywood Boulevard, and he offered me a job going out with him every Thursday. We would take the day off from his business, and he would go out with me, and I'd have an itinerary of what I continued to be the best artist in LA, and he would buy the art, and I would make a little commission, and I got the idea and the fun of dealing with this crazy man. And we would go out every Thursday, and we would go in my car because that wouldn't attract attention. He would sit, I would be driving, and then his car, the main car, would follow us in case I wasn't a good driver. So he was really protected. And every Thursday we would go out and spend the day together, and we went with different people, and I discovered, so many artists that I had heard about in the past. And I was able to really discover that again and take him through it, and he became a major, major collector. All right, so I worked for the Matisse family here in Beverly Hills, and Peter Matisse, who was running the gallery in Beverly Hills, hired me, and he actually lived very traditionally. He lived in a small apartment on Wilshire, near all the markets. He liked to eat, and he was always around. And then I wanted to go to New York and find a more exciting life. I went to New York, and on the plane, I sat next to a man who was extremely attractive. And I remember looking up at God and saying, thank you, because I thought, be my next husband. I mean, I knew him 20 minutes, I was that naive. And a lot of times when we're very young, we make decisions without having any idea of what's right and what's wrong. Anyway, by the time we got to New York, I was ready to marry this guy. He was the head of CBS, vice president of CBS Radio. And when I found him on the plane, I didn't know much about radio, but I got right into it. And I loved it, and I loved the idea of him teaching me. I mean, when we got to New York, he didn't offer me a train ride into the city or a cab ride or anything. I had to take care of all that myself. But I did find him, and I did work for him, and I got to know him, and then I married him. And we had 2 fabulous children. Both are very successful. When I moved to East Hampton, my first husband took me there and introduced me to Joan Mitchell, who had been in a therapy group with him. And it was just amazing because I just got to know those people very quickly. And right away, I started looking for de Kooning. And that's where I found him, was through Joan Mitchell. She was living next door to me, and she always had Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns around her house. They were always her pals. They always stayed with her. And I became a friend of hers and got to meet all the artists. And through that, I got to know Bill de Kooning. I saw him at in a truck in front of some pharmacy. And later I asked the pharmacist driving the car, who was that? Was that Bill de Kooning? He said, yes. And I said, could I meet him? And I said, he comes here every morning at 7:30. If you get up and you get to the pharmacy before we get there, and sooner or later he'll see you and ask who you are, and I'll be able to introduce you. So for 3 days, I'd go there early in the morning before they got there, and I'd try to hang around East Hampton, the little town that we all know in East Hampton, and I waited around for him, and then the big truck would come up. And the third day, John came around and said he'd like to meet you now. Mr. de Kooning would like to meet you. So I walked over to the truck they owned, and Bill was getting his mail or something at the post office or at the pharmacy, and he asked me to lunch. I heard him tell a couple of stories from the car. He had the driver and the car and the truck and everything, and he asked me to lunch, and I said, oh, I'd love that. And so I transferred my car, which I don't know where I even left it. I was so thrilled to meet Bill de Kooning. And I went home with him, and I stayed for a year. I made, differences, like I pretended to be interested in the art world still, but that was my real focus, and learning from him about the real art world and what it was going to be like and would it be difficult. And then he wanted to have a birthday party for me, and he wanted to take over a restaurant that it was in East Hampton, because his home was, at that time, always East Hampton, with a second, place where he could change his clothes in New York City. But so I went to I invited people to fill up this big table in East Hampton at the restaurant we were going to. And I invited the Parkers, Ray Parker and his wife, and I invited my friends, and I invited just different people in the art world that he had really introduced me to. And we had this wonderful dinner, and I just remember thinking, how could I be so lucky to have Bill de Kooning, my boyfriend, who's having this big birthday party for me, and I don't know quite what to do. And I didn't know how to get out gracefully at the end of the dinner party. So I asked him to drive me home, and he had his drivers, he had drivers take me home to my apartment, my house, by myself, and then they went off. But Bill always had things to do, and he never drove, he always rode a bicycle. And he would take me to parties, and we would go all around East Hampton. If somebody else was driving him, then that would count. But usually he was always on a bicycle, and then I'd have to find a bicycle and go with him places. And I never went home. I avoided coming home for about a year. And then finally my family said, get home. And I did, and that was it. And then I opened my own gallery. After a while working for people, I thought, well, I could open my own gallery. And so a guy came by, his name was Stephen Eyraud, Eyraud, and they owned the rapid transit system. And I had gone to high school with him, and I knew him. We were neighbors in Hollywood. And he came in one day and said, I'd like an art gallery and I'd like you to help me. And I said, I'm fine, I'm ready to go. And he said, I'll support you, and I want you to teach me about art so we can open the Eyraud Barnes Gallery together. And so we did. And he didn't really know much about art. He finally ended up with a better gallery than I had, because he was working so quickly on what he was going to do. And but I got to know a lot about. I worked with him 3 years. We had a gallery on La Cienega. It's still there now. Now it's not a gallery, but it's right next door to the liquor store, John and Pete's, on La Cienega. And that's when I was so happy, because that was my first gallery. And I showed pretty good people, and Frank Eyraud helped me a lot. We really got right into the scene. Baldessari was one of our big finds, and that was extraordinary because he became a star so quickly. All he did, You know, I have this book about him. All he did was talk about the artists and how they used language as paintings. And that's his first book was called Pure Beauty, and that was the whole painting. And he went through that, and most of his paintings were about writing about art. And in my kitchen, I have a painting of him talking about how to make it in the art world, 4 steps to make it. He was extraordinary, and I learned a lot. And then when Stephen decided he didn't want to be in the gallery business at all, he left the gallery to me, and I found somebody else to help me. I also got very much into the idea of teaching here. I taught at Otis Parsons. I taught at Otis Art Institute. I taught at several of the art galleries how to make it in the art world. I've written books. I have one book on the art world and how to make it and how to get to be in a gallery. And usually it requires finding somebody who likes you, starting to work for them, and then they realize that you have some brains and you're taken in, and they add your name to the list of people who are very, very conversant in the art world. There also was a lot of art going around, right around downtown LA, around Robertson, and where all the people were really speaking up about art and their collections. And mostly it was people in the show business, and I just loved that. Billy Wilder, because he talks about people's personal problems at a high level. Like the people he reported on were all rich and all had, you know, big dinner parties and everything. And I remember being invited to go to some of those dinner parties and thinking, okay, I wanted to know Billy Wilder. And I got to know him when I was working in galleries. And he had some of the top movies out. And so I went to his parties when I was invited, and I would meet everybody. They'd be sitting around the piano, all singing songs, and they were all the songs I wanted to sing and all the songs I wanted to know and all the movies I wanted to know about. And I just thought he was fantastic. And that was one of the big deals in that he collected art. He started with Picasso. He started buying, you know, from all the Picasso people here, and then he started making decisions on his own, and he always picked the right artist. I just loved him. He was fabulous. And then he had his own little gallery right in Beverly Hills on the 2nd floor of Brighton Way. But then I started finding people here. George Herms, he was very, very important, and I knew him because we went to Berkeley together. And we played in the Shalom-Ash here in Berkeley. And I was the Virgin Mary and he was Joseph. And I found people like that were doing, reworking religious aspects of life. And I got fascinated by that. But I also loved the idea of the people out here who were really making it. I did show Andy Warhol, but I stupidly didn't. And what he was doing, he was an egotist. He lived with his mother in New York, but he always really knew how to pick people to make portraits of and take advantage of. And he would find them, look them up in the phone book, and then go to their house. So he was supporting a lot of rich people in New York who wanted their portraits done. And I liked that, and I also liked him because he was so smart about how to pick people. And if you know anything about Warhol and you look at any of his books, you see he always picked the smart people to photograph and also to do portraits of. And also politicians. Politicians were very important. And one of the things he did was he did 40 paintings of Central Park in New York. And I grabbed right onto that and started showing all those people that he was talking about, having paintings for them, because everybody wanted to have their painting done and never knew how to find Andy Warhol, and I was always available to show them how to get there. That would be, but he just died this week, Hockney, David Hockney. He lived right up the street from my friend Rolph Nelson, who was a top composer, arranger, and he would always take me as his date when he was getting awards for all the wonderful films he made for the music for, and I always wanted to be a part of that group. So he helped me a lot, and then Hockney lived up the street, and I started really courting him because he had a beautiful big house, and he was always doing the interiors. And then he got to Marcia Wiseman, who was Norton Simon's sister, and he got Marcia Wiseman interested in collecting art. And I thought that was extraordinary because right away she took over in the art world and became very famous. And also she was buying all the art for Cedars Hospital, Cedars-Sinai. And I wanted to be a part of that whole group. And yeah, so I got in there. And Marcia Wiseman was another, there's a picture of her in my dining room. She was another big find for me. I could talk to her. She understood everything. And she had also had difficulties with parents who didn't want her having jobs and doing all the things that I wanted to do. A lot of art was done at the Ambassador Hotel before people started finding places for themselves. And I would go to the Ambassador all the time and try to find out who was the dealer that was having a show there. And that was very important to me, to find places where you could get in. You know that place too? I know. Yeah, it's the Ambassador Hotel. And it was owned by very, very rich people. And that was where they let people come in and have galleries. And I just thought that was wonderful. Wow. Right downtown, Rossmore and Wilshire. I used to go to lectures once a month given by somebody, and I can't remember who it was, but they had it was like the PTA. It was like you went to a thing and you learned about art. Going to these lectures. And I thought that would be great for me. Why don't I write a book so that I could go to these lectures and I could get my book published? So I started writing this book. And there was a man named Sterling Lord. He was a very famous art, well, he was a publicist and he also published books. But he was very interested in art. And so I wrote this book and he published it for me. And he just died a couple of years ago, or a year or two ago. But God, he was so important in my life because he knew everything about everything except he didn't know about art. So I was able to teach him. And then there was one lady that lived up the street here, and I was able to help her. And she was the head of Vogue magazine, Eleanor Phillips, and that helped me a lot because they got me in. And then when I published this, I hired this guy to write, do the painting on the front and the back. And it's about how to get hung in the art world. And that gave people some legitimacy when they bought my book because it was for sale everywhere. And also I was finding out how people made it in the art world. And a lot of it was just hanging on and hanging out with a group of artists who would support you. Joe Good was one that was very supportive of other artists making it. Rolph Nelson we talked about. And I just liked the idea that there were people you could go to and you could really learn how to make it and how to be influential. At that time, abstract art, which I've talked about, was becoming very popular. And everybody wanted to do abstraction because they didn't have to do a figure or anything. And I remember going to see Herb Alpert and different people, and they were all trying to do abstraction. Herb Alpert had been a very well-known music person, and he went to Fairfax High School, supported them, made so much money in the work that he was doing with music. And then when I found him, he was really trying to get into the art world, and so I worked for him a lot of times, putting him on the map. I ran his art gallery, which I started, and then I learned how to take care of myself, and it was fabulous. I thought that if I could buy some of the best art that was going on in the world in my lifetime, that I would have a collection and I would be able to sell it. and I don't want to part with it now. It's all through this room that we're sitting in. And it just makes me happy when I'm in here, and I think how lucky I was to have gotten in here and found all these people like de Kooning and Pollock and all the people that that was the first artist I ever showed right over there. And then, you know, just all of them come into my head and I start getting excited. Marcel Duchamp, I bought one of his pieces. He was at somebody's house where I was, and I said, let me buy that. And I just found out that it was really easy to buy art before people became very famous. A lot of artists think that if they do things a certain way, they'll get into galleries easily. And that isn't true. In my book, I really talk about that, the idea of coming up with something that's unique, hanging out with artists that are smart who will help you because they'll see the beauty that you have, and then they will help you and it won't be a competition. They'll be starting you. Joe Good was a perfect example of an artist that nobody paid attention to, and then suddenly he started hitting it, and he started painting food, and everybody wanted to be his friend, I guess because they were hungry, but also because he was a very, very good facilitator.